So today we're going to take a little bit of time to conversate about what the NBA decided to do with the Utah Jazz in regards to Lauri Markkanen sitting out against the Washington Wizards of all teams. A fine of $100,000, which to me doesn't really make all that much sense. But we'll get into that in a moment. With that being said, it's your boy Wraith Hoops. If you're new to the channel, go to smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on post notifications. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into this one. We're talking about a version of Lauri Markkanen that ended up starting off the season shooting about 48% from the field, 44% from three-point range, and then also almost 90% from the free throw line. But the back injuries have always been nagging him, and more so this season than in the previous season. And I know at the beginning of the year, I had said that because we were expecting the tank, we were going to see a lot of him sitting out. And if anybody has any semblance of injury, and they are one of our more mainstay type of players, your Colin Sextons, your John Collins, even Walker Kessler at times, you would expect them to sit out because that's how tanks kind of work. You want to get the young guys in. You want to have an excuse to play the young guys as much as possible so that if you lose a game, oh, well, we tried our hardest. Now, to the Jazz's credit, this hasn't been the worst tanking season that I've ever seen. Now, have there been some ugly games? Absolutely. But I've never watched an entire stretch of this season and just felt like this was the most hopeless thing the Utah Jazz could have done. When you look at the Washington Wizards or the New Orleans Pelicans, they have multiple losing streaks that go over 10, 11, 12 games at a time. And the Utah Jazz, the longest losing streak of the season was just 8 games. Now, of course, they have a couple of sets where they lose 5 or 6 games, but that's to be a little bit expected. However, that also can kind of tell you that they are giving a genuine effort at times. If you want to say not every game, perfectly fine. But to assume that they're just tanking without any semblance of honor or any desire to actually see what they have and test things out and give guys a genuine opportunity to show that they can play the game of basketball, I think that would be a really, really disingenuous thing to say. And for the NBA to go ahead and say, we're going to fine you guys $100,000 for a locally televised game against another tanking team who's worse at tanking than you are, or better at tanking, I guess, who's better at tanking than you guys are. And we're just going to act like them tanking is just anything. But you know what? Lauri's definitely 100% healthy. I feel like there's something wrong with that. Now, for those that remember watching, Lauri ended up having a injury that kept him out after a bit when he came into a collision with Victor Wembanyama. This was around Thanksgiving break, I want to say, a little bit beforehand, as a matter of fact. Now, after that, for a short period of time, he ended up shooting about 36% from the field and 21 or 22% from three-point range, which is incredibly uncharacteristic of him. Then, from December 8th, all the way up to about mid-February, late February, he ended up shooting a little bit better, but not by much. And by not by much, I mean 41% from the field and 32% from three-point range. This is the same Lauri Markkanen that was shooting almost 40% lights out last season over the entire year. So if we're going to sit here and pay attention to the numbers indicate if you're that good a shooter on any night for an entire year, we're not talking 5 games, we're not talking 10 games, we're not even talking a 20-game stretch. We're talking about an entire season with the Utah Jazz. Being on the Jazz has unlocked him. He's had the ability to shoot lights out whenever he feels comfortable, and he's been letting that thing spray. He's known as the best 7-foot shooter alongside Karl-Anthony Towns, and which poison you pick is entirely up to you. I'm a Lauri Markkanen guy personally. I just like the way he plays basketball a little bit better, and I think he's a little bit less of a defensive liability compared to Karl-Anthony Towns, when you put both of them at the 5, of course. In that same vein, if you see a guy that shoots okay, and then he has a bad stretch, then you can kind of just say, well, it was bound to happen at some point. But when you have a guy who's considered to be a marksman, he's supposed to be at the top of his game at his particular position and a particular attribute, and then all of a sudden he sucks at that attribute, I think that it's kind of relevant to assume his injury history. And considering that he's always had lower back problems, and yes, the Jazz are supposed to be tanking, so could there be 2-3 games here, there, and in between where his back isn't hurting and we decide to sit him out? I believe that's possible, but I think it's disingenuous for the league to sit here and say, oh yeah, he's perfectly healthy. He clearly, very clearly, for me, now I could just be blowing smoke out of every orifice of my body, but I think he's genuinely hurt. Now, granted, the Washington Wizards are sorrier than the Utah Jazz are, but I've never really seen the Jazz so far this season play a game against a tanking squad and say, oh yeah, we have to lose that one. because we lose against all the better teams. So for the most part, us beating a tanking team isn't going to do much for us unless we end up tied with them. And once you get to the bottom 4 in the league, you all have the same odds at the first overall pick. So it doesn't make a difference. So to sit there and just nitpick in that way to the fine of $100,000, I can't remember the last time an organization got fined for sitting out a star player in this particular way. Now, nationally televised games, tournament games, games that have a lot of draw for attention and make the league a lot of money, that makes sense. We've seen that happen before. We've seen the league say, hey, we're doing an investigation. Something seems off. We've seen those. But a little rinky-dink game on a random day of the week against a team that is also not primetime television. The Washington Wizards haven't been primetime television since maybe John Wall days back in like 2016, 2017-ish at latest, if I want to give them that much. Because even with Bradley Beal after John Wall left, they were a decent team, but they weren't anything to tip your hat to by a very large margin. So to sit here and find the Utah Jazz if they're doing the most criminal thing in the world, it just feels like somebody said, you know what? Today's the day. We're going to mess with you guys. And for me personally, that just seemed like it was the most roundabout way of having a conversation regarding his injury history. Now, it does give me the personal opportunity to talk about the fact that I do think that he is having a down year, but it's not necessarily because he's a bad player, nor do I think that he will not bounce back. I just genuinely think that he's playing and he's a little bit hurt. He's a little bit hampered. I don't think it's going to be something, terrible like Joel Embiid tends to have every so often. But at the same time, I do think that it is significant enough that we have to actually give some semblance of understanding to it. It's kind of like having an injury to your shooting hand. When people say that they have a contusion on their offhand, on their non-shooting hand, a lot of people don't spot them that much because it's like, okay, well, you don't flick your wrist with it. Now, if you're a Kyrie Irving kind of shooter and you shoot with that thumb and you have a thumb injury on your left hand, well, that's going to be significant. Now, shooting hand injuries are regarded with a lot more understanding because that's something that actually goes into it. Your back, similarly, you can't shoot without your back. The lift comes from your legs, up through your back, through your arms, and out through the fingertips. So if a large part of a 7-footer's body is back and he has back problems, and he's always had back problems, this isn't new. This isn't new to the Utah Jazz. It's not like we just created this injury out of thin air. It's a legitimate injury that he's been had. So the fact that it's now becoming a problem and the Utah Jazz, after getting fined, immediately just switched him and made him available the next day, I'm not going to sit here and say that perhaps he was okay to go. I'm sure he may have been, but we're not going to sit here and assume that he's at 100% because I refuse to believe, me personally, again, personal opinion, I refuse to believe that Lauri Markkanen at full health is going to give you 40% shooting from the field and 33% shooting below league average shooting from beyond the arc. The year after being a marksman from that same position on more minutes of action. Typically when players have reduced roles because whether it be they add in new star talent or if you decide to tank or if you just have younger guys that are blowing out and showing off, their numbers usually get better because they have a reduced role and there's less attention on them. But if your minutes go down and all of your splits across the board go down, and there's an injury that's said to be lingering, I'd like to believe that the injury is actually lingering. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Did this catch you guys as off guard or seem as weird as it did to me? Or does it seem to be just something that's going to happen, bound to happen, and if the Jazz decide to tank next year, we'll probably see more of it? Or for the rest of this season, will we see more of it? With that being said, though, it's your boy Ray Tubes. If you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you. Go and smash that like button, subscribe, turn on post notifications, or become a member of the channel to help support the content. And as always, good morning, good evening, and good night, no matter where you're in the globe watching. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.